The G20 was launched in 1999. Initially, it was a gathering of finance ministers and central bank governors aimed at discussing international economic and financial issues. The group accounts for almost two-thirds of the global population, 70% of the global trade, and 85% of the world's GDP. South Africa has been a member of this group since its inception in 1999. When Asia was facing financial crisis, the African Union became a permanent member last year. The meeting in South Africa next year comes at a time when there has been criticism that the global political tensions often derail the G20 meetings. This is something South Africa will have to avoid when hosting the meeting.
Since the beginning of the Ukraine war, particularly in the Indonesian presidency, there was no leaders summit. Well, there was a leaders summit, but the leaders agreement was not one that was consensus-based. And the ministerials all had footnotes that indicated the various positions that different countries had taken on that particular war. In the Indian presidency, also in the ministerials, there were also footnotes. But in the leaders summit, there was a consensus agreement because the Sherpas just before that developed an approach that was based on international law, and that sort of brought in the agreement of all countries, including Russia and the USA, into an agreement based on key principles of the Charter. But of course, soon after that, we had the situation in Gaza and the genocide unfolding there, and we found that the very same agreements that were applicable and acceptable in the context of Ukraine are suddenly not acceptable in the context of Palestine. So the issue has resurfaced, but I think the Brazilian presidency has taken a view and an approach that we have supported from the beginning, is that the geopolitical issues will be dealt with at a Sherpa level, a foreign minister level, and a leaders level, and that allows the sectoral streams to focus on the key issues of development.
The African Union is now a new member of the group.
The G20 is a product of a crisis, and it was able to manage a crisis. The world economy was able to come out of a very major economic and financial crisis. And I'm very much convinced that in spite of the challenges that are emerging, should be able to ride through these challenges and become more relevant. Why do I say so? Because initially we had the G7, and there was a realization that both in terms of output and in terms of demography, there was needed to really come up with a larger number of people to come up with any informal institution of global governance, which is the G20. And going ahead again, we see those trends continuing. Demography and economic output are being spread across the world. So there's that element of interdependence which no one can ignore. Granted, there's fragmentation right now in the global economy, but there is demand for what are called critical minerals. We call them strategic minerals. There's going to be demand for water, demand for food, and all this demand for labor. All these are products of interdependence. So the challenge now that faces the world community is to say, in spite of these challenges, how do we hold each other? And the Brazilian presidency came up with an initiative which is not going to be institutionalized, but to have a meeting of foreign ministers on the margins of the G20 open to all members of the United Nations. That's a spirit of inclusivity.
This This will be the second important meeting chaired by
Thank you very
President
much, Your
Cyril
Excellencies,
Ramaphosa
leaders of the
after the
BRICS nations,
successful hosting
Your
of the
Excellencies,
BRICS
leaders from
Summit
across
last
Africa,
year.
Your Excellencies,
Sophie
leaders
Mukwege,
of the Global South,
SABC News,
all
Johannesburg.
other